In the 1950s, a brilliant engineer created a device that turned a massive diesel engine into a giant air brake. It stopped runaway trucks from careening off steep mountain passes and saved countless lives. It was hailed as an absolute highway miracle. Yet fast forward to today, and drivers are slapped with massive fines and treated like public menaces just for trying to stop their 80,000-pound rigs safely. How did a mechanical masterpiece, built purely to save lives, become public enemy number one? The answer is one of the strangest paradoxes in transportation history. To understand why the Jake brake became both hero and villain, we need to go back to the mountain highways of the 1940s, where truckers faced a deadly choice every time they encountered a steep downgrade. Picture the winding roads of the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Passes, and the Sierra Nevada ranges. These weren't just challenging drives, they were death traps, waiting to claim the next overloaded truck whose brakes couldn't handle the descent. Back then, truckers relied entirely on their service brakes, the same brake system your car uses today. Press the pedal, brake pads squeeze against rotors, and friction slows the vehicle down. Simple enough for a 2,000-pound car, but imagine a fully loaded truck weighing 80,000 pounds descending a 6% grade for 10 miles straight. Those brake pads would heat up to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, causing what truckers call brake fade. The brakes would literally stop working. When that happened, drivers had only two choices: ride it out and hope they could control an out-of-control missile weighing 40 tons, or aim for a runaway truck ramp if they were lucky enough to find one. Most weren't that lucky. The mountain highways were littered with the twisted metal remains of trucks that couldn't stop in time. Clessie Cummins saw this problem firsthand. As the founder of Cummins Engine Company, he watched truckers struggle with brake failure on mountain passes throughout the American West. But Cummins had an engineering background that went beyond just building engines. He understood that the solution wasn't more brakes, it was using the engine itself as a brake. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of letting the engine coast during downhill descents, what if you could turn that massive diesel engine into a giant air compressor? What if you could harness the compression stroke that normally builds power and redirect it to create resistance? In 1958, after retiring from his own company, Cummins filed the patent for the first compression release engine brake. By 1961, it was rolling off production lines, later known as the Jacobs engine brake, or Jake brake for short. The engineering was elegant. During normal operation, diesel engines compress air in the cylinders, inject fuel, and create the explosion that drives the pistons down. But the Jake brake interrupted this cycle at just the right moment. Here's how it worked. As the piston reached the top of its compression stroke, building maximum pressure in the cylinder, the Jake brake would open the exhaust valve. All that compressed air would suddenly release through the exhaust system, creating massive back pressure that resisted the engine's rotation. Instead of the engine helping push the truck down the hill, it was now fighting against the truck's momentum. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Truckers could maintain safe speeds on even the steepest grades without touching their service brakes. The constant heat buildup that caused brake fade was eliminated. Brake pad life increased by thousands of miles. Most importantly, runaway truck accidents plummeted on routes where Jake brakes became standard equipment. But there was one side effect that nobody anticipated: the sound. When compressed air gets forcibly expelled through an exhaust system designed for normal engine operation, it creates a distinctive staccato burst that can be heard for miles. The larger the engine, the louder the noise. And by the 1970s, truck engines were getting much larger. The sound of a Jake brake isn't just loud, it's aggressive. Imagine someone firing a machine gun loaded with air instead of bullets. That's the closest comparison to the rapid-fire bursts of a fully engaged Jake brake on a big rig diesel engine. At full throttle, an unmuffled Jake brake can produce sound levels exceeding 110 decibels, louder than a chainsaw or rock concert. For truckers, this noise was the sound of safety. Every burst meant their service brakes were staying cool, their brake pads were lasting longer, and they were maintaining control on dangerous descents. The louder the Jake brake, the harder it was working to keep them alive. But for the communities along major trucking routes, that same sound became a nightmare. The first complaints started trickling in during the late 1960s. Residents living near truck routes reported being jolted awake by Jake brake noise at all hours of the night. The sound would echo off buildings, bounce between hills, and carry for miles in the right atmospheric conditions. What was even worse, the noise was unpredictable. Unlike highway noise that maintains a consistent level, Jake brakes would fire in sudden, startling bursts that made it impossible to get used to. Hotels along trucking corridors noticed guest complaints about sleep disruption. Property values in neighborhoods near truck routes began declining. Homeowners couldn't enjoy their backyards or keep their windows open on nice days. The quality of life in these communities was being destroyed by a device designed to save lives. Cities nestled in mountainous regions soon became battlegrounds for Jake brake restrictions. Throughout the 1970s, after months of resident complaints about trucks descending steep hills surrounding their towns, municipalities across the United States began passing strict noise ordinances. These new laws prohibited the use of compression-release engine brakes within city limits except in extreme emergency situations. The trucking industry fought back immediately. The American trucking associations argued that banning Jake brakes was a safety issue that would lead to more accidents, more brake fires, and more runaway trucks. They pointed to statistics showing dramatic reductions in mountain highway accidents wherever Jake brakes were commonly used. They argued that noise ordinances were prioritizing comfort over human lives. But the damage was already done. Early ordinances became a template for other communities facing similar noise complaints. Within 5 years, over 50 cities had enacted Jake brake restrictions. By the 1980s, that number had grown to over 200 municipalities. The bans created a patchwork of regulations that truckers found nearly impossible to navigate. A driver hauling freight from Los Angeles to New York might encounter dozens of different Jake brake ordinances along the route. Some cities banned Jake brakes entirely. Others allowed them only during daylight hours. Some restricted their use to emergency situations only, but didn't clearly define what constituted an emergency. The confusion led to a cottage industry of Jake brake enforcement. Police departments in small towns along major trucking routes discovered that Jake brake violations were an easy source of revenue. Fines ranged from $50 to over $500 per violation. Some departments stationed officers at the bottom of hills, where trucks would naturally engage their Jake brakes, creating what truckers called speed traps for engine braking. The enforcement was often arbitrary and unfair. A trucker might use his Jake brake to maintain safe speed on a steep descent, only to be ticketed at the bottom of the hill. The officer writing the ticket had likely never driven a fully loaded truck down a mountain pass, and didn't understand that the choice was often between using the Jake brake or risking brake failure. Meanwhile, the safety benefits of Jake brakes continued to prove themselves on mountain highways. Departments of transportation across mountainous states, like Colorado, began tracking accident rates on steep grades before and after Jake brakes became standard equipment. The historical results were dramatic. Officials recorded massive drops in runaway truck ramp usage on stretches of highway where engine braking was common. Incidents of catastrophic brake fires plummeted across the board. The technology was undeniably saving lives. But saving lives wasn't enough to overcome the political pressure from noise complaints. Communities that had never experienced a runaway truck accident couldn't relate to the safety benefits. All they knew was that their sleep was being disrupted and their quality of life was suffering. The Jake brake wars intensified throughout the 1990s. Trucking companies began routing loads around cities with strict Jake brake bans, adding hundreds of miles to delivery routes and increasing shipping costs. Some companies invested in expensive muffler systems designed to reduce Jake brake noise, but these systems reduced the effectiveness of the engine braking and required constant maintenance. Truck manufacturers tried to develop quieter Jake brake systems, but the physics worked against them. The rapid release of compressed air that created the braking force was inherently noisy. You could muffle it, redirect it, or time it differently, but you couldn't eliminate the sound without eliminating the safety benefit. The irony was lost on most city councils passing Jake brake ordinances. They were banning a device that could save their own lives if they ever found themselves driving a truck down a steep mountain pass. The same technology they were legislating against could prevent the very accidents that might someday affect their own community. The conflict continued to escalate into the 2000s as cities like Riverside, California, and countless others pushed for some of the strictest Jake brake ordinances in the country. These local laws often imposed massive fines for Jake brake use within city limits, and sometimes authorized police to penalize trucks for repeat violations, occasionally making no exceptions for emergency situations or steep grades. The trucking industry frequently challenged these aggressive local ordinances at the state level, arguing that they created unsafe driving conditions and unfairly targeted commercial drivers just trying to survive a descent. These legal clashes dragged on for years in various jurisdictions, during which time truckers sometimes avoided certain towns entirely, causing significant economic damage to local businesses that depended on freight delivery. Ultimately, the consensus established that communities could restrict Jake brake use for noise control based on existing vehicle code limits, provided they didn't create blanket bans that completely compromised highway safety. Today, the Jake brake remains standard equipment on virtually every commercial truck in America. Modern versions are somewhat quieter than their predecessors, thanks to improved muffler technology and more sophisticated engine timing systems. But the fundamental trade-off between safety and noise pollution remains unchanged. Over 400 cities across the United States now have some form of Jake brake restriction on their books. To navigate these hundreds of varying local laws and enforcement challenges, commercial GPS systems now include specialized Jake brake restriction databases, alerting drivers when they're entering areas where engine braking is prohibited. The trucking industry has largely adapted to these restrictions by developing alternative strategies for steep descents in urban areas. Lower gear ratios, improved transmission retarders, and better route planning help truckers maintain control without relying solely on Jake brakes. But industry safety experts estimate that Jake brake restrictions still contribute to dozens of preventable accidents each year. The Jake brake story illustrates a fundamental challenge in modern transportation policy. How do you balance the safety benefits of technology against its negative side effects? How do you weigh the lives saved by engine braking against the quality of life impacts on communities along trucking routes? There's no easy answer, and the debate continues today. Environmental groups push for even stricter noise regulations, while safety advocates argue that Jake brake restrictions prioritize comfort over human lives. Truck manufacturers continue working on quieter engine braking systems, but physics limits how much the noise can be reduced without compromising effectiveness. Today, as electric trucks begin entering commercial fleets, the Jake brake may finally face obsolescence. Electric motors can provide regenerative braking without any noise at all, offering the speed control benefits of engine braking without the acoustic drawbacks. The technology that once seemed irreplaceable may soon become a relic of the diesel age. In the end, the Jake brake story reminds us that progress always comes with trade-offs. Sometimes the cure creates symptoms almost as challenging as the original disease, but in the case of the Jake brake, those trade-offs have been worth it. The noise pollution is real, but so are the thousands of lives saved by a technology that turned truck engines into giant air brakes.